Chapter 12, Surgical Ethics and Law. Introduction. This chapter incorporates references to English common and statute law. Nevertheless, these legal and ethical principles have much in common with many other jurisdictions across the world. Surgery, ethics, and law go hand in hand. In other arena of public or private life, if someone deliberately cuts another person, draws blood, causes pain, leaves scar, and disrupts everyday activity, then the likely result will be a criminal charge. If the person dies as a result, the charge could be manslaughter or even murder. Self-evidently, the difference between the criminal and the surgeon is that their intentions differ. While a criminal intentionally or recklessly inflicts harm, the surgeon's intention is limited to the treatment of illness. Any harm that ensues is either unintentional or is necessary, such as an incision, to facilitate treatment. Patients submit to surgery because they trust their surgeons. What should consent entail in practice, and what should surgeons do when patients need help but are unable or unwilling to agree to it? When patients do consent to treatment, surgeons are provided with a wide discretion. The end result may be cure, but disfigurement, disability, and death may also result. How should such surgical power be regulated to reinforce the trust of patients and to ensure the surgeon's practice to an acceptable professional standard? Are there circumstances in the public interest in which it is acceptable to sacrifice the trust of individual patients through revealing information that was communicated in what patients believe to be conditions of strict privacy? These questions about what constitutes good professional practice concern medical ethics and law relating to consent, confidentiality, and the underlying concept of personal autonomy. In addition, these principles need to be applied to surgical activities, including professional matters relating to governance, regulation, and the process of revalidation in its different guises around the world. Surgical training is starting to embrace the basic science of surgical law to offer surgeons assistance in the resolution of such ethical dilemmas. This chapter is evidence of that process. Respect for autonomy. Surgeons have a duty of care towards their human patients that goes beyond just protecting their life and health. Their additional duty of care is to respect the autonomy of their patients and their ability to make choices about their treatments and to evaluate potential outcomes in light of other life plans. Such respect is particularly important for surgeons because without it, the trust between them and the patients may be compromised, along with the success of the surgical care provided. We are careful enough in everyday life about whom we allow to touch us and to see us unclothed. It is hardly surprising that many people feel strongly about exercising the same control over a potentially hazardous activity such as surgery. For all these reasons, there is a wide moral and legal consensus that patients have the right to exercise choice over their surgical care. In this context, a right should be interpreted as a claim that can be made on the surgeon. The surgeon therefore accepts the strict duty to respect the patient's choice regardless of personal preferences. Thus, to the degree that patients have a right to make choices about proposed surgical treatments, it then follows that they should be allowed to refuse treatments that they do not want, even when surgeons think that they are wrong. The right to make an unwise decision was exemplified in a recent case where a woman with capacity refused renal replacement therapy. The court reminded doctors that, notwithstanding the fact that other citizens might consider her decision unreasonable, illogical, or even immoral, none of these criticisms of the decision by themselves provide evidence of a lack of capacity. Patients can refuse surgical treatment that will save their lives either at present or in future. The latter through the formulation of advanced decisions or lasting powers of attorney specifying the type of life-saving treatments that they do not wish to have, notwithstanding that they may later become incompetent to refuse them. Informed consent. In surgical practice, respect for autonomy translates into the clinical duty to obtain informed consent before the commencement of treatment. It is easy to underestimate the gap in understanding between a surgeon and his or her patient. How many patients would recognize that unilateral eye surgery might lead to contralateral blindness? The risk and side effects of many operations are not intuitive, and the surgeon is not in the position to guess how the patient's plans for employment, leisure, and family life may be inadvertently affected by a foreseeable complication. A budding Olympic gymnast might choose to forego surgery on a quiescent posterior lateral lesion if he or she knew the potentially consequences of division of the accessory nerve. That is why patients need to be informed beforehand so they can choose whether to take the risk. To establish valid consent to treatment, patients need to be given appropriate and accurate information. In England and Wales, the Department of Health's reference guide to consent should be consulted. Such information disclosed during a formal and tangible discussion must include the condition and the reasons why it warrants surgery, the type of surgery proposed and how it might correct the condition, the anticipated prognosis and expected side effects of the proposed surgery, the unexpected hazards of the proposed surgery, any alternative and potentially successful treatments other than the proposed surgery, the consequences of no treatment at all. With such information, patients can link their clinical prospects with the management of other aspects of their life and the lives of others for whom they may be morally and or professionally responsible. Good professional practice dictates that obtaining informed consent should occur in circumstances that are designed to maximize the chances of patients understanding what is said about their condition and proposed treatment, as well as giving them an opportunity to ask questions and express anxieties. Where possible, a quiet venue for discussion should be found. Written material in the patient's preferred language should be provided to supplement verbal communication together with diagrams where appropriate. Patients should be given time and help to come to their own decision. The person obtaining the consent should ideally be the surgeon who will carry out the treatment. It should not be, as in sometimes the case, a junior member of staff who has never conducted such a procedure and thus may not have enough understanding to counsel the patient properly. Good communication skill go hand in hand with properly obtaining informed consent for surgery. It is not good enough just to go through the motions of providing patients with the information required for considered choice. Attention must be paid to whether or not the patient has understood what has been stated, avoiding overly technical language in descriptions and explanations, the provision of translators for patients whose first language is not English, asking patients if they have further questions. When there is any doubt about their understanding, patients should be asked questions by their surgeon about what has supposedly been communicated to see if they can explain the information in question for themselves. Surgeons have a legal as well as moral obligation to obtain consent for treatment based on appropriate disclosure. Failure to do so could result in one of two civil proceedings, assuming the absence of criminal intent. First, in law, intentionally to touch another person without their consent is a battery, remembering that we are usually touched by strangers as a consequence of accidental contact. Surgeons have an obligation to give the conscious and competent patient sufficient information in broad terms about the surgical treatment being proposed and why. If the patient agrees to proceed, no other treatment should ordinarily be administered without further explicit consent. The second legal action that might be brought against a surgeon for not obtaining appropriate consent to treatment is in the tort civil wrong of negligence. Patients may have been given enough information about what is surgically proposed to agree to be touched in the ways suggested. However, surgeons may still be in breach of their professional duty if they do not provide sufficient information about the risks that patients will encounter through such treatment. Although standards of how much information should be provided about risks vary between nations, as a matter of good practice, surgeons should inform patients of the hazards that any reasonable person in the position of the patient would wish to know. In UK law, this level and style of disclosure has been most recently reviewed in the case of Montgomery and Lanarkshire Health Board. Finally, surgeons now understand that when they obtain consent to proceed with treatment, patients are expected to sign a consent form of some kind. The detail of such forms can differ, but they often contain a very little of the information supposedly communicated to the patient who signed it. Partly for this reason, the process of formally obtaining consent can become overly focused on obtaining the signature of patients rather than ensuring that appropriate types and amounts of information have been provided and have been understood. Both professionally and legally, it is important for surgeons to understand that a signed consent form is not proof that valid consent has been properly obtained. It is simply a piece of evidence that consent may have been attempted. Even when they have provided their signature, patients can and do deny that appropriate information has been communicated or that the information was effective. Surgeons are therefore well advised to make brief notes on what they have said to patient about their proposed treatments, especially information about significant risks. These notes should be placed in the patient's clinical record, perhaps by referring to the disclosure in the letter to the family doctor, copied to the patient. In addition, information sheets describing the generic risks, benefits, and complications associated with the proposed procedure can be provided. Practical application. Thus far, we have examined the moral and legal reasons why the duty of surgeons to respect the autonomy of patients translates into the specific responsibility to obtain informed consent to treatment. For consent to be valid, adult patients must first have capacity to give it, able be able to understand, remember, and deliberate about whatever information is provided to them about treatment choices and to communicate those choices, not to be coerced by decisions that reflect the preferences of others rather than themselves, be given sufficient information for these choices to be based on an accurate understanding of reasons for and against proceedings with specific treatments. Surgical care would grind to a halt if it were always necessary to obtain explicit informed consent every time a patient is touched in the context of their care. Fortunately, it is an elementary step merely to ask the patient whether they mind being examined. The usual response will be acceptance. This simple transaction illustrates that the legal and ethical rules that govern a surgeon are often no more than an expression of good clinical practice, in this case, politeness. Some patients will not be able to give consent because of temporary incapacity. This may result from their presenting illness or intoxication, or an unanticipated situation may be encountered midway through a general anesthetic. The moral and legal rule that governs such situation are clear. The doctrine of medical necessity enables the surgeon in an emergency to save life and prevent permanent disability operating without consent. This is employed daily where unconscious emergency patients undergo surgery to save life and limb. No consent has been provided and none is required. Providing the treatment is in the patient's best interests. However, if the patient has made a legally valid advanced decision refusing treatment of the specific kind required, that decision must be honored providing it is applicable to the current clinical situation. Where possible, surgery on patients who are temporarily incapacitated should be postponed until their capacity is restored and they are able to give informed consent or refusal for themselves. Surgeons must take to respect the distinction between procedures that are necessary to prevent death or irremediable harm and those that are done merely out of convenience. If the patient consents only to a dilatation and curettage, do not consider performing an additional hysterectomy in her best interest simply because she is anesthetized. Consent may be made impossible by incompetence of other kinds. In the case of children, parents or someone with parental responsibility are ordinarily required to provide consent on their behalf. This said, surgeons should take care to explain to children what is being surgically proposed and why. Always consult with children about their response. Where possible, take the child's view into account and note that even young children can be competent to consent to treatment provided that they too can understand. Remember, deliberate about and believe information relevant to their clinical condition. Plainly, it is almost always appropriate in addition to discuss the treatment with their parents. When such GLIC competence is present under English law, children can provide their own consent to surgical care, although they cannot unconditionally refuse it until they are 18 years old. These provisions illustrate that the importance of respecting as much autonomy as is present among child patients, and remembering that for the purposes of consent to medical treatment, they may be just as autonomous as adults. If capacity in adults is erased by psychiatric illness or mental handicap, other moral and legal provisions hold. If patients lack the autonomy to choose how to protect themselves as regards the consequences of their illness, then others charged with protecting them must assume the responsibility. However, care must be taken not to abuse this duty. Even when such patients have been legally detained for compulsory psychiatric care, it does not follow that such patients are unable to provide consent for surgical care. Their capacity should be assumed and consent should be sought. Only if it is established with the help of their carers that such patients also lack capacity to provide consent for surgery and that they are at risk of death or serious and permanent disability can therapy then proceed in their best interests. However, if treatment can be postponed, then this should be done until, as a result of their psychiatric care, patients become able either to consent or to refuse. If this recovery is not predicted, then legal steps may be taken to make elective surgery lawful. As with children, respect should always be shown for as much autonomy as is present. Absence of capacity in adults does not vitiate the requirement, where possible, to take into account their sentiments during clinical decision making. In a recent case, a judge declared that an elderly man with a septic leg, although incapacitated by his mental illness, had feelings, beliefs, and values that weighed so heavily in the consideration of his best interests that they outweighed the clinical desire to save his life by amputation. Although an unusual judgment in this context, it reflects the growing determination to give incapacitated adults an opportunity to influence their fate as best they can. In adult patients who are permanently incapacitated and thus unable to provide consent for surgery, as noted above, the doctrine of necessity obtains and surgery can proceed in an emergency to save life, to prevent serious and permanent injury. Elective treatment for less grave complaints can also be provided in England and Wales is done so under the auspices of the Mental Capacity Act 2005. The Associated Code of Practice guides the surgeon in matters of capacity and disclosure and in dealing with those who have taken steps to influence their treatment, anticipating the time that they will have lost their capacity. These arrangements may manifest either in documentary form as advanced decisions or in person in the form of persons appointed with a lasting power of attorney. It is not possible for relatives of incapacitated adult patients to sign consent forms for surgery on their behalf. Indeed, to make such requests can be a disservice to relatives who may feel an unjustified sense of responsibility if the surgery fails. This said, relatives play a vital role in providing background information about the patient, allowing the clinician to assess and then determine what treatment is in the best interest of the patient. Matters of life and death. It has been noted that the right of an adult with capacity to consent and to refuse lawful treatment is unlimited, including the refusal of life-sustaining treatment. Probably the example of this most familiar to surgeons is Jehovah's Witnesses, who may refuse blood transfusions at the risk of their own lives. There will be some circumstances in which sustaining the life and death of incapacitated adult patients is judged to be inappropriate. They are no longer able to be consulted and may not have expressed a view about what their wishes would be in such circumstances. Here, if possible, after discussion and consensus with the next of kin, a decision may be made to withhold or to withdraw life-sustaining treatment on behalf of the incapacitated patient. The fact that such decisions can be seen as omissions to act does not excuse surgeons from morally and legally having to reconcile them with their ordinary duty of care. Ultimately, this can only be done through arguing that such omissions to sustain life are in the patient's best interests. The determination of best interests in these circumstances will rely on one of three objective criteria over and above the subjective perception by the surgeon that the quality of life of the patient is poor. There is no obligation to provide or to continue life-sustaining treatment. If doing so is futile, when clinical consensus dictates that it will not achieve the goal of extending life, thought of in this way, judgments about futility exclude considering patient's quality of life and thus can be difficult to justify as long as treatment might stand even a very small chance of success. If a patient is imminently and irreversibly close to death, in such circumstances, it would not be in the patient's best interests to prolong life slightly. Example, through the application of intensive care when again there is no hope of any sustained success. Declining needlessly to interfere with the process of a dignified death can be just as scaring as the provision of curative therapy. If patients are so permanently and seriously brain damaged that lacking awareness of themselves or others, they will never be able to engage in any form of self-directed activity, the argument here is backed up by moral and legal reasoning that further treatment other than effective palliation cannot be in the best interest of patients and it will provide them with no benefit. And any of these principles are employed to justify an omission to provide or to continue life sustaining treatment, the circumstances should be carefully recorded in the patient's medical record along with a note of another senior clinician's agreement. Furthermore, the decision to discontinue life sustaining treatment may go hand in hand with a decision not to attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation in the event of cardiorespiratory arrest. In England, it is settled law that before finally making this decision, doctors must discuss it with patients or their relatives. The reason for this instance is that the patient may have personal circumstances unbeknown to the surgeon which might yet influence this final and for the patient spontaneous decision. The only exclusion to this legal rule is where decision of this matter with the patient may cause them not merely distress but harm. Finally, surgeons will sometimes find themselves in charge of the palliative care of patients whose pain is increasingly difficult to control. There may come a point in the management of pain where effective palliation is possible at the risk of shortening a patient's life because of the respiratory effects of the palliative drugs. In such circumstances, surgeons can, with legal justification, administer a dose that might be dangerous, although experts in palliative care are skeptical that this is ever necessary with appropriate training. In any case, the argument employed to justify such action refers to its double effect that both the relief of pain and death might follow from such an action. Intentionally killing, active euthanasia, is rejected as unlawful malpractice throughout most of the world. A foreseeable lethal analgesic dose is thus regarded as appropriate only when it is solely motivated by palliative intent, and this motivation can be documented. Recent authority from criminal law indicates that if an analgesic injection is virtually certain also to kill the patient, a court might deduce that the person giving the injection had an intention to kill. The key to the defense of double effect is the absolute absence of such an intention. Transplantation. The law and ethics of organ transplantation require more space than this chapter allows. In common and with other nations, the UK has a statutory framework for transplantation, but even amongst this small group of nations, there is no unanimity of legislation. Thus, rules for deceased and live donor transplants differ. In general, the rules for defining a dead donor, for compensating a living donor, and for legitimizing a market in organs differ widely. It is strongly recommended that you refer to the rules within your own jurisdiction. Confidentiality. Respect for autonomy does not entail only the right of capacitous patients to consent to treatment. Their autonomous right extends to control over their confidential information, and surgeons must to respect their privacy, not communicate information revealed in the course of treatment to anyone else without consent. Generally speaking, such respect means that surgeons must not discuss clinical matters with relatives, friends, employers, and others unless the patient explicitly agrees. To do otherwise is regarded by all the regulatory bodies of medicine and surgery as a grave offense, incurring harsh penalties. For breaches of confidentiality are not only abuses of human dignity, they again undermine the trust between surgeon and patient, on which successful surgery and professional reputations of surgeons depend. Important as respect for confidentiality is, however, it is not absolute. Surgeons are allowed to communicate private information to other professionals who are part of the healthcare team, provided that the information has a direct bearing on treatment. Here it is argued that patients have given their implied consent to such communication when they explicitly consent to a treatment plan. Whether implied consent is ever be valid is a matter of public debate, as government attempts to apply the doctrine to tissue donation and access to electronic health records. Such examples of implied consent are better viewed as mere acquiescence of patients ignorant of and not objecting to decisions made about them. Patient cannot expect strict adherence to the principle of confidentiality if it poses a serious threat to the health and safety of others. There will be some circumstances in which confidentiality either must or may be breached in the public interest. For example, it must be breached as a result of court orders or in relation to the requirements of public health legislation. Confidentiality may be waived in the interests of preventing serious crime or to protect the safety of other known individuals who are at risk or serious harm. Research. As part of their duty to protect life and health to an acceptable professional standard, surgeons have a subsidiary responsibility to strive to improve operative techniques through research, to assure themselves and their patients that the care proposed is the best that is currently possible. Yet there is moral tension between the duty to act in the best interests of individual patients and the duty to improve surgical standards through exposing patients to the unknown risks that any form of research inevitably entails. The willingness to expose patients to such risks may be further increased by the professional and academic pressures on many surgeons to maintain a higher research profile in their work. For this reason, surgeons and physicians who face the same dilemmas now accept that their research must be externally regulated to ensure that patients give their informed consent, that any known risks to patients are far outweighed by the potential benefits, and that other forms of protection for this patient are in place. Proper indemnity in case they are unexpectedly harmed. The administration of such regulation is through research ethics committee, and surgeons should not practice in research that has not been approved by such bodies. Equally, special provisions will apply to research involving incompetent patients who cannot provide consent to participate, and research ethics committees will evaluate specific proposals with great care. In practice, it is not always clear as to what constitutes research that should be subjected to regulation as compared with a minor innovation dictated by the contingencies of a particular clinical situation. Surgeons must always ask themselves in such circumstances whether or not the innovation in question falls within the boundaries of standard procedures in which they are trained. If so, what may be a new technique for them will count not as research but as an incremental improvement in personal practice. Nevertheless, major innovations in operative procedure are scrutinized by national regulatory authorities in the UK by the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. This process of scrutiny has been designed to ensure that the innovation is safe, efficacious and cost effective. It is regarded by the NHS as a mandatory step when introducing a new interventional procedure. Equally, surgeons know that exigencies of operative surgery sometimes demand a novel and hitherto undescribed maneuver to get the surgeon and the patient out of trouble. Providing your solution is necessary, proportionate to the circumstances, performed in good faith, and would pass the scrutiny of your peers as reasonable, it is unlikely that any subsequent criticism of your actions could be sustained. If a proposed innovation passes the criteria for research, it should be approved by a research ethics committee. Such surgical research should also be subject to a clinical trial designed to ensure that findings about outcomes are systematically compared with the best available treatment and that favorable results are not the result of arbitrary factors. Example, unusual surgical skills among researchers that cannot be replicated. Maintaining standards of excellence. To optimize success in protecting life and health to an acceptable standard, surgeons must only offer specialized treatment in which they have been properly trained. To do so will entail sustained further education throughout a surgeon's career in the wake of new surgical procedures. While training, surgery should be practiced only under appropriate supervision by someone who has appropriate level of skill. Such skill can be demonstrated only through appropriate clinical audit to which all surgeons should regularly submit their results. When these reveal unacceptable levels of success, no further surgical work of that kind should continue unless further training is undergone under the supervision of someone whose success rates are satisfactory. To do otherwise would be to place the interest of the surgeon above that of their patient, an imbalance that is never morally or professionally appropriate. Surgeons also have a duty to monitor the performance of their colleagues, to know that a fellow surgeon is exposing patients to unacceptable levels of potential harm, and to do nothing about it is to incur some responsibility for such harm when it occurs. Surgical teams and the institutions in which they function should have clear protocols for exposing unacceptable professional performance and helping colleagues to understand the danger to which they may expose patients. If necessary, offending surgeons must be stopped from practicing until they can undergo further appropriate training and counseling. Too often, such danger has had to be reported by individuals whose anxieties have not been properly headed and who have then been professionally pilloried rather than acknowledged for their contribution to patient safety. Those who participate in closing ranks and ostracism share the moral responsibility for any resulting harm to patients. If something goes wrong with surgical treatment, the UK health regulators unanimously insist that the patient should be told what has happened. In many senses, a similar disclosure to that which occurred during the consent process, but now with the benefit of hindsight. Again, this candid disclosure is designed to put the patient in the same position as the surgeon with respect to information about their health. Conclusion: surgeons have combined duties to their patients to protect life and health and to respect autonomy, both to an acceptable professional standards. The specific duties of surgeons are shown to follow from these: reasonable practice concerning informed consent, confidentiality, decisions not to provide or to omit, life sustaining care, surgical research, and the maintenance of good professional standards. The final duty of surgical care is to exercise all these general and specific responsibilities with fairness and justice and without arbitrary prejudice, now at least partly either enshrined in statute or echoed in the English common law. These duties closely reflect the guidance of the General Medical Council. The conduct of ethical surgery illustrates good citizenship, protecting the vulnerable and respecting human dignity and equality. To the extent that the practice of individual surgeons is a reflection of such sustained conduct, they deserve the civil respect that they often receive. To the extent that it is not, they should not practice the honorable profession of surgery.